Hi, my name is April, and this is High Fantasy Writing. While I do consider myself primarily a writer, I do love every single form of storytelling. I love oration, I love comic books, I love movies, I love Broadway plays, musicals, all sorts of different ways to just express a story. But one method of storytelling that I never really thought I would get into is Dungeons and Dragons, or more broadly, just tabletop role-playing games. I do usually use Dungeons and Dragons or D&D as shorthand for all tabletop role-playing games, just because that's the one that has the most name recognition, and that's immediately invokes something in people's minds when they hear that. When you hear tabletop role-playing games, most people probably don't actually know what that looks like. You might hear tabletop game and think like Monopoly or some sort of board game and kind of miss out on the role-playing aspect. So that's why I usually do say D&D or Dungeons and Dragons to mean all tabletop role-playing games, as will come into clearer focus throughout this video. Dungeons and Dragons is not the only tabletop role-playing game. Sorry, my cat's roaming around. It's not the only tabletop role-playing game, nor may it be the actual best game to fit your needs. So throughout my entire life, I have known about Dungeons and Dragons. It's always kind of been on the periphery, it's mentioned in TV shows, it's just kind of something that you hear about in different forms, but I had never really looked into it. And as I was talking to my brother about Dungeons and Dragons, he did even bring up the stereotype that when he went to college, he did know about it, but it was really only in the circles of people who did not bathe regularly playing the game. So it had a very strong stigma to it, not just with the crazy satanic panic people, but even in modern day, it wasn't viewed in a favorable light or a light where cool people would be playing it. It was a game for nerds, it was a game for people who didn't have great lives outside of fantasy, so they had to throw themselves into a fantasy world in order to feel fulfilled in their lives. Now, these can be really harmful stereotypes, but also just kind of annoying because that's what everybody does, especially with storytelling. Like, you become obsessed with Breaking Bad because you want to experience something other than your normal life. You get obsessed with Game of Thrones because you want to experience something outside of your normal life. You become obsessed with following sports because you want to experience something outside of your normal life. That's what hobbies are, that's what storytelling is, that's what communal activities are, is throwing yourself into a world that you don't actually inhabit, but you can be an outside viewer of, or you can play fantasy football and feel like you are sort of a part of this world that you aren't actually a part of. Now, my main hurdle with getting into Dungeons and Dragons, or tabletop role plays in general, was the fact that I never really gravitated to the storytelling of video games. Video games, I know, can be a great method of storytelling, but for me, they always felt very constraining in the rules. You can only go in these certain places, the narrative. The issue I found was that books, you know that you are just an observer of this narrative. You know that the author has already decided where these characters are going. Video games, in my view, in the video games that I had played, pretended to say you're in charge, but they were still very limiting. They were still very straightforward. No, you have to make these choices. You have to fight this guy, you have to do it in this way, rather than the broader, what I felt video games kind of should have been, which I then later found out D&D was, in that it's more open to you writing the story itself. So all of the rules and constrictions of combat that I saw in the D&D games, and how your fate could completely change just by a bad roll of the die, it felt very like not the type of storytelling I was into. The way I viewed all tabletop role-playing games was pretty much just an in real life video game. You would still be very constrained, you would still be told, well, here's the big bad, you have to defeat him in this specific way, and if you don't, then you lose the game. And that just didn't appeal to me. As a writer, I have a really strong feeling of I don't want to give up control of a narrative that I am creating, or in the case of a tabletop roleplay, a narrative that I am a part of. You become a part of this narrative, and giving up control and letting the dice take over, letting combat rules take over, letting other players or the DM take control, or being constrained by the limits of your particular character's race or class. Just, it wasn't appealing to me because I was so afraid of losing that control. So though I loved all types of storytelling, and I could appreciate the storytelling one could have with tabletop role-playing games, I kind of just wrote it off for myself personally and said, I can't feel fulfilled in the storytelling with this thing that I'm seeing. Even though I hadn't really seen much of it, I didn't really look into it more and felt like, no, my storytelling is writing, my storytelling is being in complete control of the narrative, and so I'm going to not even branch out to try and see how a different method of storytelling, collective storytelling of the tabletop role-playing world, could enhance my own novel writing. So with all of those preconceived notions and barriers that I felt were in my way to entering the tabletop role-playing world, how did I get into it? Because I have been playing for over a year now. I have been researching it for like a year and a half at this point, and I am a dungeon master and also a player in a Dungeons & Dragons 5e campaign. Both of them are Dungeons & Dragons 5e system that we're running. My entrance really began with watching YouTube videos that were about storytelling in the movies genre. So I loved watching people's reviews of movies. I loved watching people's reaction to movie trailers. I loved watching people break down movie news and entertainment news, which is how I got into watching Screen Junkies. So they are a part of the Fandom Network right now on YouTube, and it's just a bunch of people who I think are pretty cool. They talk about movie news, entertainment news, just anything around movie productions, things that are coming out, things that have already come out and how well they're doing in the box office, things like that. Now, one of the hosts, Joe Starr, would, during a certain period of time, a couple of months, would always plug the another channel, Hyper RPG, and he would say that he was part of a tabletop role-playing live stream called Pencils and Parsecs, which used the Edge of the Empire role-playing system to play this Star Wars game over on this other channel with a couple of other people. Now, I had always heard that and thought, oh, that sounds pretty neat to, see somebody, who I already had known on YouTube and liked watching on YouTube, I also found out that Hector Navarro, who I had also loved when he was way back on Superhero News and moved over to Hyper RPG, now they're on Heroes Reforged. It's him and the trio of Hector, Augustine, and Adam. I had already liked him, so it was a lot easier for me to stomach the 3-hour runtime of something that I wasn't even sure I would like if I saw those familiar faces, people who I had already seen on YouTube and I really enjoyed. That really opened the door for me to give tabletop role playing a chance. But unfortunately, that 3-hour runtime did stop me for a very, very long time from actually checking it out. And then I watched The Rise of Skywalker, which is the last movie in the sequel trilogy of the Star Wars canon. I did not enjoy the storytelling of The Rise of Skywalker at all. I loved a lot of the character moments that were in The Rise of Skywalker, but the story I felt was massively lacking. And since I had been inundating myself with all of this movie and entertainment news, people analyzing stories, people critiquing and reviewing movies, I started thinking about movies very differently. And so when I saw Rise of Skywalker, I was so disappointed, and I loved the Star Wars world so much that I started really itching for more stories set in that world that were completely different, that were not the we are all Jedi, chosen one, must save the galaxy stories. And I finally said, okay, I have heard about this pencils and parsecs thing. I know that I like several of the people who are going to be a part of it, well, who already were a part of it. And I had decided to make time for the 3-hour-long runtime. And that's what I did. I started watching Pencils and Parsecs on Hyper RPG, and I immediately fell in love. I was so excited to see stories in the Star Wars universe collectively told, and told by people who I already liked. And then I fell in love with the entire cast of Pencils and Parsecs, and I thought it was so much fun and such a unique way to tell stories. And it had a little bit to do with the OG trilogy, because I believe Edge of the Empire is set in between the Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I believe that's the time period that Edge of the Empire the system is set in. And I just loved how narrative focused this role-playing system was. There wasn't a whole bunch of rules, I felt like, that constrained the players in what they could do. There was so much more freedom of deciding how they were to approach a conflict or a situation that I had never even thought that a role-playing game could offer. I didn't think that you were allowed to go so far out of the regular, this is your goal, you have to directly go to your goal and then fight a bad guy and achieve your goal. I thought that that was all it was, and Pencils and Parsecs really showed me that it was not what I had thought. It was truly a collective storytelling in a world that I already knew with people who I liked. So it was kind of the perfect introduction for me into the tabletop role-playing world. Now, as excited as I was about Pencils and Parsecs and the Star Wars-ness of the storytelling and creating Star Wars characters who would fit in the Star Wars universe, even if they weren't Jedi, because none of the characters in Pencils and Parsecs were Jedi. So it was really cool, and I loved that. But I don't have many friends who I have easy access to who have that level of knowledge about Star Wars. So a lot of what was fun to me about being in the Star Wars world in Pencils and Parsecs were the mentioning of different things, the mentioning of Alderaan, the mentioning of Luke Skywalker, how the rebels functioned, and I didn't feel like narratively it would be as impactful to me if I was playing with people who didn't know that Star Wars shorthand. So I decided to start looking into just the generic fantasy world tabletop role plays, and D&D Dungeons and Dragons is the one with the most name recognition. It's the one that has probably the most out there tutorial wise, people talking about it, explaining the rules system, resources wise. Dungeons and Dragons is just the one that's easiest to access. And so I decided to start looking into that and seeing how I would begin to start playing in the tabletop role-playing world. Now, I started, as so many people do, by researching on YouTube. I would watch all of the different tutorial channels that I could about how do you start playing Dungeons and Dragons, what even is Dungeons and Dragons, anywhere from the tiny channels where their videos only had like 50 views on them, all the way up to super big channels with really great production quality and huge backlogs of videos where I could go and look at all of the different videos they had done over the years. I wanted to see what play was actually like in this new system that I hadn't played before, because as I quickly realized, the system for Edge of the Empire is very different from Dungeons & Dragons 5e. 5e, I feel like, has a lot more rules, and it's a lot more structured than the Edge of the Empire, which I felt the way the Pencils and Parsecs crew ran it was very narrative focused and very nebulous, kind of sandbox world type of deal. I felt like the Dungeons & Dragons 5e was a lot more structured. Exactly, these are your spells, these are your attacks, this is how you do them, these are a whole huge list of ability checks and things like that. And so I wanted to know what actual play would look like in the Dungeons & Dragons world, as I had never seen a live play of Dungeons & Dragons. I found a whole bunch of really great channels talking about it, great resources, but by far my favorite was the Dungeon Dudes on YouTube. I felt like their presentation was so easy to approach. It was very approachable, very clear, concise. I understood what they were saying. It was very easy for a very new person to jump into one of their videos and get what was going on. They also have a really great backlog of everything that you could possibly want dealing with Dungeons and Dragons, so I found them to be an incredible resource. During this time, I was still watching Pencils and Parsecs, obsessing over it. Very sad that it was, I was getting towards the end of the live stream, and I was like, no, it's going to be over. But I began to read the Player's Handbook. I read the entire Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. I read a lot of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I read several of the Settings book. I did all of that to really sink myself into the Dungeons & Dragons world, to learn about the lore, to learn about the different options, because there are so many little bits and pieces about histories of towns, histories of the continents that have already been written about Faerun, which is the most popular setting for Dungeons & Dragons, that I really just wanted to lore dump myself and really become a part of this world so that it could feel more natural when I came into it as either a player or a DM. During that time, I very sadly finished Pencils and Parsecs, and there was a huge hole left in my heart because I had fallen in love with the world, I had fallen in love with the story, I had fallen in love with the characters, and it was really, really sad to see them go. I had fully fallen in love with the storytelling method of tabletop role-playing games. Now, with 3 hours of my day freed up from not watching Pencils and Parsecs, I decided to try and find a Dungeons and Dragons playthrough streamed campaign that I could really see how everything unfolded, to see how I would want to go about starting my own game. Luckily enough for me, at the end of every single Dungeon Dudes video, they plug their live play, the Dungeons of Dragonheim. And I said, you know what? It worked the first time. I found people on YouTube that I enjoyed watching, and then they happened to have a live play, so I decided to watch their live play, and voila, I liked it. Let's see if Dungeon Dudes is the same, and wonderfully, it was. It was fantastic. I loved it. It was, again, kind of the same as the Pencils and Parsecs, and it just blew all of my preconceived notions about what tabletop role-playing was out of the water. It showed me that it didn't just have to be the very stereotypical fantasy setting, because Dungeons of Dragonheim takes place in a very eldritch horror type of world where there is a crumbling city that everyone has to go through. It's not the Lord of the Rings style fantasy, which I love. Don't get me wrong. I would so play a Lord of the Rings tabletop roleplay fantasy style. Absolutely. But it was just another feather in my cap, I guess, in my being able to expand what I thought tabletop roleplay would be, and Dungeons and Dragons 5e specifically. I also loved how this one, again, was very personal quest focused. So the narrative really revolved around each of the different player characters having a reason to be in the story, and the dungeon master expanding upon that. And that felt so much more like actually writing a novel to me than my preconceived notion of it's like a video game, the story is already set up, and you just have to follow the story, even if you yourself don't really have a stake in it. You just gotta follow the steps of the video game anyways, because that's just the game. I really loved being able to have that narrative freedom that I get as an author in a tabletop role-playing game, and watching the Dungeons of Dragonheim really showed me how I could incorporate that in my own story, how I could bring my writer's brain to becoming a DM, because I decided that since I didn't have any friends who were into Dungeons and Dragons, I decided that since I had already read all of the rule books and everything and had been researching it, that my role would just naturally fall as the DM. And so I got really excited seeing how I, as a DM, could narratively encourage my players. And so slowly, bit by bit, my preconceived notions about how maybe tabletop role-playing wasn't the storytelling method that would resonate with me, slowly that began to chip away, and I began to see how myself as a writer could really flex my writing skills in Dungeons and Dragons, or tabletop role-playing in general. Now, feeling confident that I wouldn't feel constrained by the rules of the Dungeons and Dragons system, I began to float the idea around with my 2 roommates and one of my friends from college about, hey, if I started a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, would you join? And thankfully they all said yes, and it was very similar to me. They had heard about Dungeons and Dragons. Some of them had watched a couple of live stream plays or watched people talk about Dungeons and Dragons, but they had never really looked into it or considered playing themselves, just because time constraints, just the resources might not have been available. And a lot of times there just isn't room. If you do have friends who play, their table is already full. So there isn't room for you to jump in as a newbie, because there is a little bit of gatekeeping in the Dungeons and Dragons community about who can play and when. A lot of times people don't like playing with brand new players, because they feel like it'll slow down the story, it'll slow down combat, etc., because, they're playing with somebody who hasn't been playing since, they were kids. I even ran into this myself, as one of my friends from high school who lives pretty far away, and we just text sometimes. I mentioned to him that I was into Dungeons and Dragons, and he's like, oh yeah, I just started playing as well. My girlfriend is a part of a campaign and they let me join. And I told him that I was going to start DMing, and he said, oh, well, you can't DM if you haven't been a player yet. You should try and find a game that's already running, or find somebody to DM who's already been a DM. And I'm like, well, I don't have anybody in my life who's like that, so do I get to play or do I not get to play? And I just decided that, you know what? If you don't have friends who have already been playing D&D, if you don't have people in your life who have already been dungeon masters a lot, then you can do it yourself. And I just decided that I was going to do it myself. I was going to say, you know what? I'm going to do as much research as possible. I'm going to watch live plays, and I'm going to prepare myself to be a dungeon master, even though I had never played. None of my players that I had gathered up had ever played, and we were just going to be an entirely newbie group of Dungeons and Dragons players. And that is how I got into Dungeons and Dragons. I started out with so many preconceived notions about the type of storytelling tabletop role-playing games were, and how I felt like there were so many limitations and constraints, and I would have to give up so much narrative freedom that I wasn't willing to give up at the time. And by actually researching what it was, watching a couple of live streams, and all of that jazz, I was able to actually stop having those preconceived notions, have them completely debunked, and now I'm really, really enjoying being both a DM and a player, because I did find an online group of people who I had never met before to play with as well. So I have been in that campaign since the beginning of this year, and I have been DMing my campaign since probably about this time, or a little bit before this time last year. And so that is my story of how I got into D&D, and how I feel that as a writer, D&D and tabletop role-playing games can actually be a really great way for you to flex your writing muscles. It's going to be very, very, very different from writing a novel, but I think that there are so many lessons in storytelling in general that we can take from this collective group storytelling, group story creation, that we can put into our own individual books, novels, comics, screenplays, Broadway shows, etc. I think that it's a really great resource for you to have, and some experience in your belt for different storytelling avenues if you want to be a writer yourself. In the future, I can do a couple more videos on Dungeons and Dragons and how I created my own campaign, and how I created my characters, how I approach playing my characters or being a DM, and how I use my skills as a writer to do all of those things, if you guys are interested in seeing that. I haven't decided to fully create my own setting yet. I know homebrewing is a huge thing that especially people who have writer-like tendencies really love to dive into, and I have homebrewed a good bit of my DM campaign, but I haven't quite yet decided to jump into the creating a whole new setting. Maybe I will at some point, and you guys will be able to see my process in doing that, but that is farther in the future. But that is all for today's video. Again, my name is April. This is High Fantasy Writing. I'm so glad you stuck around to watch. I hope you enjoyed. Leave a like and hit subscribe if you want to see more from me. I make videos on writing advice, critiquing advice, how to tell if advice is even good advice or not, and reviews, critiques, analysis of different TV shows and things like that. I've done a video about the Loki series that has just dropped on Disney Plus, and of the Shadow and Bone series that was on Netflix. Anyways, I hope that you have a great rest of your day and happy writing!